Wetwork Media presents Dan Lauer's Post Meridiem, an unreliable memoir of madness in Los Angeles. For CC and LL, without whom this would have always been just a nasty rumor, which it is. Author's note and various disclosures. All names in this memoir other than my own have been altered for reasons that will become apparent relatively quickly. Composites of both characters and situations have been utilized for brevity, legal protection, and perhaps most importantly, because the way events unfolded in my malfunctioning gray matter at times bears little to no resemblance to the way it actually unfolded. I began writing the first haphazard notes and passages of the following story as it occurred in June of 2009. So all details are rendered as I understood them at the time. Whether or not that makes this a true story will be a question for the ages, and history may or may not treat it with kindness. It should be obvious where I completely fabricated scenarios simply for comedic effect. I have, for instance, never, ever had a protracted argument with my GPS system. Ever. I classify myself with no prompting or coercion as an extremely unreliable narrator, given my mental state at the time of these events. I assure you, however, the neoconservative conspiracy is alive and well, and they are currently breeding ape-human hybrid Ubermensch to institute a Kafkaesque coup d'etat in these United States. Beware, fellow travelers. The end is nigh. Auf Wiedersehen. I sleep in the daytime. I work in the nighttime. I might not ever get home. Talking Heads. Life during wartime. Prologue. In the land of the Lotus Eaters. Then I told the rest to go on board at once, lest any of them should taste of the lotus and leave off wanting to get home. So they took their places and smote the gray sea with their oars. Homer, the Odyssey. Two women were savagely beating each other on the corner of Sunset and Palm in West Hollywood. One of them was screaming, "What happened to the dream?" as the fight intensified and thrashed all over the sidewalk. This was no catfight. Punches were thrown in quick succession, a prize fight between two meth casualties, each with a handful of the other's hair, leveling haymakers wildly at faces and heads as they struggled for solid footing, which never came. I couldn't help but wonder what the dream was, and if either of them knew, indeed, what happened to it. Probably not. It was likely a question that would never be answered to either woman's satisfaction. I had only been in Los Angeles for 3 days, and this scene probably should have frightened me to my core. A sign of things to come, perhaps? Instead, it served as a kind of revelatory moment. There really are people like this here, I thought. And I was gripped with some morbid enthusiasm that lodged itself deep in my core. What other crazy, heavy, frightening, bewildering sights would each new day bring? I was stopped at a red light to make that precarious, arrowless left onto Palm over Horn Avenue and watch the scene unfold, only shifting focus now and again to take note of the complete lack of reaction from pedestrians who simply sidestep the women as they continue to scream and pound on each other in front of the crosswalk. Nothing to see here. One of the women was in her mid to late 40s, the other was a young-looking 20-something. They wore almost matching outfits, tight, torn, acid-washed jeans and dark t-shirts with band names from the 80s on them. Costume jewelry dangled from their wrists as they flailed, tearing ferociously at each other, pulling out handfuls of long, greasy, unwashed hair and tossing each other all over the pavement. "What happened to the dream?" One of them again screamed and then punched the other square in the nose. It was a clean hit, sending blood and small yellowish honks of what could only have been infected mucus onto the pavement beneath their struggling feet, both of which were bare and bleeding. When the light turned green, I didn't move, my gaze firmly locked on the fight. The car behind me leaned on the horn, and after a few additional moments of gawking, I made my way onto Palm Avenue and ventured cautiously into the rest of my third day in that city, maintaining a steady eye for other brawls on random street corners as I went, wondering if I, too, would soon get used to the sight and learn to ignore it. A few weeks later, I attended an Easter brunch hosted by a business associate of my father's. The invitation was extended as a courtesy, a favor to my father, so I wouldn't be completely lost and alone for too long upon my arrival in a city without friends, aside from my roommate John. But I didn't fit in with the people, and the invitation had the inverse effect on me, making me feel more lost and alone than before I joined them. A few moments after being seated at an excruciatingly bougie bistro in West Hollywood with a party of 10, I leaned subtly over to one of my co-diners and said, "That man over there looks a lot like Billy D. Williams." He smiled and shrugged, sipping from his gratis flute of Easter brunch champagne. "That is Billy D. Williams," he said. He then turned back to another, more interesting conversation at the other end of the table. This was my first star sighting in LA, and it left me oddly shaken. Billy D was normal, quiet, reserved, unassuming. Lando. No Colt 45 to be seen anywhere. It felt eerie. There he was, quietly eating and drinking with a friend or lover, or both. Sipping the champagne, poking at the Eggs Benedict, and talking about nothing in particular like a real goddamn human being. And sure, his fame had waned in the years since Reagan was in power and George Lucas was king of the box office, but he was someone nonetheless. A face from the screen. I felt like a hayseed, a rube. Two things I had promised myself I wasn't since I'd learned what either was. I was the only one at our table, or it seemed in the entire restaurant, that happened to possess any enthusiasm for what was clearly a historic moment with a national goddamn treasure. After a few rounds of drinks and moments of internal encouragement, I stood and charted a course for the restrooms that would take me past Billy D's table. Couldn't be helped. Nothing I was doing purposefully, of course. But still, somehow in aid of that painful moment between fan and idol, where you stop suddenly and feign recognition as if you just happened upon them. Shock, awe, reverence. Billy D noticed all three as soon as he spotted me. He smiled, but I couldn't tell if he was bracing himself underneath it. Big fan, I told him, barely breaking my gait, but slowing enough to study him for reaction. "Cool, little dude. Cool," he said. And then he went back to his conversation as I hurried to the bathroom in a bizarre panic. My roommate John, his friend Thomas, and I were invited to a party in Orange County about 2 months into our residence in LA. The hosts were business associate of John's, a husband and wife team that had produced or invested money in some failed film project he worked on while living in Phoenix. We were promised food, drink, and a good time, maybe merriment. I'd already come to learn that a good time can mean just about anything in and around the Inland Empire, so I braced myself for whatever came. It made no difference. The three of us had nothing better to do, so we accepted the invitation, piled into the car, and headed southwest on the 5 towards Laguna Beach and those rich people we didn't belong around. After an hour of travel into the hills around Orange County, just a spit from the shoreline, we entered a huge modern McMansion designed with great detail to mimic a 1970s porn palace, vaulted ceilings, a recessed conversation pit in the foyer, floor-to-ceiling windows in the rear where you could just barely make out the white caps in the distance, and a topless woman wearing only jean shorts splayed out across a leather living room couch doing whippets from an industrial whipped cream dispenser. This was the wife. The husband wasn't home. I'd never met either of them. I don't know what I was expecting exactly, but I wasn't expecting that. "That's Annabelle," John said, as the three of us stood over her, behind the couch, watching. The sun-kissed scars of too much tanning and nitrous oxide were extremely apparent on her body, and she was, physically speaking, another bleached coastline casualty, aside from her perfect breasts, which were hanging only slightly to each side of her rib cage because of her position on her back. Annabelle was extremely deft with the nitrous-charging canisters. She would consume one, discharge it like a clip from an M1 rifle, and then slap another in, depress the lever on the dispenser, and begin inhaling from the nozzle again. She was getting no oxygen at all. and seemed to be having an amazing time for it. You guys made it just in time then for fun to start. What? Think of tits only, they month old. Even with the gasps and groans in her voice, Annabelle's accent was discernible, thick and filled with molasses from somewhere deep and remote in southern Georgia, where they don't huff the fancy industrial whipped cream canisters, but the cheap electronic air duster. The story of her journey from there to that beachy oasis was no doubt fascinating, but I never got the chance to ask. On the floor beneath her were dozens and dozens of the small silver tubes meant to add a little something extra to the prefixed dessert course in a high-class restaurant, but that were now clanking around on the marble tile as she discarded and replaced another cartridge and again began to breathe it in over and over and over again. We stood and watched silently aside from the metal on metal of the screw tip of the cartridge sliding against the dispenser as she inserted yet another. It was quickly too much for me, and I excused myself to the bathroom, which Annabelle indicated through rambling gasps was past the kitchen and down a hallway to the left. The kitchen was one of the biggest I'd ever seen, with every professional, expensive-looking cooking aid known to man stocked and at the ready, perfectly placed like it was the cover shoot for Good Housekeeping. It was apparent, however, that not a single one of them had ever been used. Those people ate out every night. There was a small side room down the hall adjacent to the bathroom. In it was a large portable wardrobe storage cart. On the cart, hung by expensive-looking mahogany hangers, was all manner of sexy Fredericks of Hollywood-style costumes and outfits. French maids and policewomen, firefighters and nuns, garters and belts and corsets and bustiers. Strange, yes, but I was getting more and more used to coming upon those things unexpectedly all the time. I stepped into the bathroom and sat in the toilet, lid down. I sat for a long time. It had been a few weeks since the thoughts had begun to return. I was still fighting them, still able to ignore them, only just, still sure this was absolutely, positively not happening again. I promised myself there and then I was not going to get high with these people, not a chance. After an amount of time I can't recall, I made my way back to the living room. My roommate, his friend, and the topless woman were all seated upright now on the couch, all staring at the same point in the room. The People's Court was on the television. They faced that spot, eyes completely empty. They'd been hitting the nitrous hard, everyone in turn, during my time in the bathroom. As casually as one could possibly muster, I asked, "So do you guys shoot movies here? There's a lot of costumes in that side room down the hall." I waited a long beat for an answer, long enough that I was about to ask the question again, sure that she either hadn't heard me or heard me perfectly and didn't possess the necessary faculties to respond. "Oh, no, 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 no. Those are for my husband," she said, and then blanked out on the television once again. "Your husband?" "Yeah," she said with too much enthusiasm. "He likes to dress up in those while I fuck him up the ass with a strap on. He'll be home soon. You can ask him about it yourself." 6 months in LA and I met Joanna. Love at first sight is an absurd cliche, and I refuse to acknowledge its possibility no matter the stories I hear, no matter how often. I did not love her at first sight, but I did feel an instant, incredibly powerful infatuation that I could barely comprehend. She wasn't attractive in the traditional sense. Additionally, she had been sick recently and was still recovering when John and I met a mutual friend of ours and Joanna for dinner at a bistro in Studio City. The medication Joanna was taking had given her fairly severe acne, and while most of it had cleared up, it was still very apparent on her forehead, her cheeks, the swell of her breasts. Her hair was dirty blonde, done up in a lazy ponytail and hid beneath a baseball cap. She wore a heavy winter fleece despite the 80-degree weather. She was tomboyish, thin, and intense-looking. That is to say, not my type. But there was something indescribable and electric about the moment I met her. The four of us ate dinner and talked about this and that, and it was fairly pleasant, but I lobbied to engage Joanna in conversation exclusively and couldn't stop staring at her. She couldn't stop laughing at me. I was working hard. Over the following weeks, Joanna and I became inseparable. She worked at a restaurant in Burbank. That was definitely not my scene, but I was there nearly every night regardless. She comped or discounted my drinks and food. She made a special effort to spend a lot of time at my table. We would sneak out to the alleyway and sit on a curb and steal a cigarette or two while she took her break, talking about Bob Dylan and what phases we were stuck in. She had gotten a late start and was still on the freewheeling. while I had Blonde on a constant loop in my car. We would giggle to each other at fights between drunken couples that spilled into the opposite end of the alley. We would stare at the stray cats scurrying past, pretending to pay us no mind. We would talk and talk and talk about everything and nothing at all. Sometimes John would accompany me, but most nights he was on the phone at our apartment arguing with his longtime fiancée who was living in upstate New York about whatever new thing was driving a wedge into their Shakespearean romantic drama. I stayed out late on those nights. My relationship status was this and that, and hers was complicated for these reasons and those, so neither of us felt the desire to define whatever was developing between us, but we enjoyed each other all the same. This went on for some time, and it was an extremely pleasant distraction from the approaching extraterrestrial, and even served to slowly quiet the thoughts that had been returning with a vengeance as I began to feel more and more isolated and desperate in this city and my new set of circumstances. Joanna had an extensive circle of friends in LA. She was a transplant from Chicago, but was a struggling actress and dug in like a tick within that community. It was an interesting group of people. Struggling producers, struggling directors, struggling set designers, struggling editors. I was ever present to represent the struggling screenwriter. Various blocks of the group gathered several nights a week to drink and discuss the failures of the previous days. Bad auditions, rejection letters, money fell through. You tire of the excuses and bad luck stories out there very, very quickly. One Wednesday night, John and I were headed to Burbank to meet the group at Joanna's restaurant. I was driving because he'd tied one on fairly early in the evening. We were about halfway there and stopped at a red light. No music was on. It was late, so there was very little traffic. "Hey, so are you into Joanna?" John asked. I immediately felt flush. There was no context for this question. I hadn't seen it coming at all and hadn't even asked myself, so I had no answer prepared. Had he been sober, he would have registered this reaction and not needed a verbal reply, but he wasn't. "What? What? Huh? No, 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 no. No, of course not," I said emphatically as the light turned green and started driving again. "Oh, okay. Why?" "I don't know. I don't know. It's just like you spent all your time with her. I figured it was, what? It was, what? All the time going to her place, walking around the Galleria, going to the beach. You hate the beach." "Yeah, and?" "Well, I don't know. You know what I'm saying." "I really don't." "Well, don't get upset." "I'm not upset." "You're not upset." "No, I just don't know where you're getting this from." "I don't know. It's just a lot of time." "A lot of time." And I just figured, what? We were approaching the restaurant quickly, nearing the thoroughfare it was situated on. I wanted to wrap up the conversation in a hurry. And he said, "I figured it was about the pussy." Somehow I forced a laugh at this. I found it repulsive when he said it, but assumed that he would think it was funny if he thought I did. As I parked a few blocks away from the restaurant, he started laughing as well, and it seemed as though the entire conversation had been wiped from his memory. Good. After that, the night progressed as most nights did with that group. This producer ran out of money. That casting agent never called back ad nauseum. After a few hours, I was wrecked, but I hadn't been drinking since I was driving. With the size of the group, it was impossible to get any quality time with Joanna anyway, and despite what I'd emphatically told John, it was the only reason I went out on those nights. The group was gathered around the bar, and the noise was loud and bad, so I wandered outside for a cigarette and started patting myself down. Somewhere between the bar and the patio, I'd lost my lighter. I heard the crack of a Bic lighter, and Johanna was standing next to me, holding the lighter out to the tip of my cigarette. "Angel, too noisy in there for you?" she asked, and put her hand on my shoulder. "Yeah, too much whining. I can only take so much. She moved her hand from my shoulder up to my head and stroked my hair for a brief but exquisite moment. I could see her looking at me out of the corner of my eyes. I stared down at the Burbank main drag. She didn't just rest her eyes on me. She was looking at me. I felt a pit develop in my stomach. "I'm probably going to bail after this cigarette." "Oh, no, the night is young," she whined. Fake whine. "Yeah, but I have a deadline and I'm beat. I'm starting to realize I'm surrounded by douchebags in there." She flashed a hurt look. Present company excluded. "That's all right. Well, if you're going to go, take my lighter. You'll need it for the ride home." All bum from someone here, she told me, and handed me the lighter, warm from the flame and from her touch. Thank you, darling. I'll go get John. Oh, I don't know. He's telling a story in there that's been going on for days. If you drag him away now, the mouth breathers will miss the boring end. I shrugged. They'll have to. I drove us here. I can give him a ride when we wrap up. I haven't been drinking much either. Haven't felt like it tonight, she said. I finished my cigarette and tossed it over the balcony onto the street. There was an ashtray no more than a foot from me. All right, then. I'll tell the jackass he's got other arrangements home, and I'll talk to you tomorrow. She smiled. We hugged. I didn't want to let go, but did. I went back inside and told John the deal. He half listened and gave a casual nod and returned to his story. I don't recall what it was about, but remember rolling my eyes as I walked out of the restaurant because I'd heard it so many times before. A few hours later, I was back at the one-bedroom apartment John and I shared, sitting at the tiny kitchen table, desperately trying to hammer through a screenwriting assignment I despised and was being paid too little for. The sound of a car rumbling up the driveway that led to the duplex my apartment was in made me lean back and smile. I'd found my lighter and wanted to give Johanna's back to her. That was also a good excuse to say a quick goodnight and perhaps have another hug. I stood, walked to the front door via the living room, which also served as my bedroom, and stepped out onto the driveway. It had gotten cold. Joanna's car was there, parked about 15 feet from the apartment's front door, and I could see my breath escaping into the night air by the illumination of her headlights. I couldn't see inside the car and didn't stop to wonder why it was still running and neither of them had gotten out. After stepping to the side to avoid the torturing brightness of the headlights and approaching the car for about 10 feet, only 5 feet between it and I at that point, I saw John and Johanna clearly through the windshield. She was half in the driver's seat. He was half in the passenger's. They were met above the center console, locked in a kiss so passionate that I knew instantly it must have been developing rapidly on my walk from the apartment to the car. Everything slowed. A bright red flashed, huge, swollen, and visceral in my field of vision. The world stopped rotating just long enough for an approaching spacecraft to enter the atmosphere without the turmoil of drag or resistance. Smooth landing, and then explosion. I tried to breathe, but took in no oxygen. In an instant, the thoughts I'd been rejecting, fighting, arguing down returned to me, and were all I could think or hear. They planned this. It was set up like this from the start. A plot underway. You were meant to see this. They know you were watching. They're laughing at you. You see that they aren't because they are still kissing, but they are somehow. There are others watching too. You are being recorded. I was still clutching Johanna's lighter in my left hand. They hadn't noticed me yet, so in one motion I turned, began to walk back to the apartment, and threw the lighter over my left shoulder without considering it or caring where it landed. I heard it connect loudly with the windshield as I threw open the front door of the apartment and charged inside, through the living room, into the kitchen, and to the back door, which led to a small concrete courtyard behind the duplex. I stepped out and collapsed on the ground, leaning against the concrete wall. I lit a cigarette and stared blankly into the middle distance of my neighbor's backyard. Sounds were all around me. They meant little or nothing. 2 car doors opened, then closed. Voices echoed on the brick walls surrounding the complex. Joanna, oh God, God, no, Dan, John, Dan, where are you? The front apartment door opened and then closed. One set of footfalls on the wooden floors inside. John, Dan, come here. Let's talk, please. Where are you? I was smoking my cigarette and I paid attention to none of it. I wasn't alone in the courtyard. If he comes out here and finds you like this, all pathetic and fetal, and smoking your little cigarette, you will kill him, yes? Yes, I think I will. How would it feel? Good, right, proper, just. How funny do you think they think this all is? Very. Yes, and the others will too. Others? Oh, yes. There are so many others. I had a feeling. You know it's true. Yes. There's another way. Don't say it. You don't need to kill him. Please, no. Only one of you needs to die to solve this. Think. Please stop. Be thankful. The signs are familiar, and though you'll miss them as they begin to build, I'll always spot them before it's too late. First comes the nagging thump, and then comes the horror. By the time the horror comes, it's nearly too late, but not quite. Horror is the leitmotif of this period. Listen to the music it makes. Such music. Turn towards the heavens and notice by the way the sun hangs heavy in the sky that the situation is painfully clear. There is no turning back. Things are becoming serious and savage. Malingering dread creeps in, steady, slow. The tide is turning. The waves of pain and despair, unfocused and malevolent though they may be, break against the shoreline of the subconscious. Things grow weary and hyperbolic. These happen in order. This, and then this, and then this. They start, and then they end. Nothing ever changes. Everything is still the same. And then the first of many battles commences. Ready the pillboxes. D-Day 0 hour is upon us. I will see you on the beach. The sun is burning a hole through his eyes and into his brain, and he can't think or reason. And there are two of him sitting in the car, mirror images. But you wouldn't know it to peer inside. One of them is in the driver's seat and the other is in the passenger's. If you were to ask him, but you couldn't, he would say that when it came right down to it, they were both in the driver's seat, struggling for the wheel. The only perceivable difference between the two is that one is an earthling and the other is not. One is somehow not from here, but elsewhere, a place that cannot be charted even on the most detailed map of the observable universe. And he asks, "Why are you doing this to me?" Well, I'm not sure how to answer that. And he says, "Please." And his voice is quivering and pathetic. Gun to my head, and he smiles. Not sure. I haven't made my mind up yet. They both laugh, and it goes spilling out of the windows and onto the punishing asphalt, heat lines slithering skyward. You are going to have to admit that you brought this on yourself. You could have taken steps a long time ago to make sure this would never happen again, but you didn't. And now look at you. You're a hideous nightmare. A fucking mess, again. And he begs, "I wish I knew where you lived in my brain so I could reach in there and grab you." He stirs in the passenger seat and doesn't buy it for a second. "You see a difference between the two of us?" And he tells himself, "There is a huge difference between you and I, my friend." "No, there is one small difference between you and I." And he asks, "What's that?" And he says, "Only one of us will be here when all is said and done." If you're enjoying Post Meridiem and just cannot get enough of a good thing, it is available for pre-order now as a beautiful ebook available from Amazon and Apple Books. The ebook version of Post Meridiem includes additional content, illustrations, and even an additional fifth part not included in the free audiobook version. Search for Post Meridiem and Dan Lauer on Amazon or Apple, or visit wetworkmedia.com/post-meridiem for more information.